Imagine being forced to sign a piece of paperwork in order to see a house. That is what is currently happening in the real estate industry. If you are a buyer out there and you want to tour any home with an agent outside of an open house, you literally need to sign documents that will bind you to that agent either for a set amount of time or for a set amount of time on that certain property. I have been saying this over the last few weeks. There has just been a time where we have been living literally in another dimension. And what I'm about to share with you just shows you how there has been a massive, massive mindset shift. But before I get into the article, I want to explain to you how we got to where we are. All right. So back in, let's say, the 80s, so on and so forth, basically, listing agents controlled the market. They effectively still control the market to some capacity today, but it was even more so enforced back then because there was not necessarily buyer agents. Listing agents would not have the multi-list where every single listing was populated on the multi-list and got syndicated through all the IDX portals, which is like your Zillow, Realtor.com, Redfin, so on and so forth. So a buyer would have to go to a real estate office. They would meet with an agent, and that agent would bring a catalog of listings. And then that agent would sell them one of those listings, which could have been their own listing or one of their office listings, so on and so forth. Then in the 90s, buyers kind of got fed up and started to smarten up. And they were like, you know what? We want somebody to represent our best interest. And that's where buyer agencies started to get created. It was like maybe in the mid 90s, and then the early 2000s is really when it started to take off. And you had a buyer agent for the buyer side and a listing agent for the listing side. Sometimes a listing agent could represent a buyer in a transaction as well. It's called dual agency. It's not something that I do. Some agents do it. I don't like doing it, but it is few and far between. So that's what happened in the early 90s to the 2000s. And a good way to look at this, if you were going through a divorce, right, you're not going to use most of the time the same attorney that your wife and or husband are using for said divorce. You would want somebody to represent your best interest, and somebody would be representing their best interest. I feel like this is pretty much common sense. Then what happened is there was a massive real estate spike after COVID. Interest rates got very low. People were moving out of cities like here in Boston, and they were just purchasing up all of the single family homes in the market because they wanted to get more space. They wanted to get more room, and people were scared of the pandemic from everything that we saw on the news. Okay. Now, what happened during that time, there was a gentleman that sold his house, got substantially over the list price on his house, and then ended up suing the real estate agent company and the National Association of Realtors. And this guy won, okay? The National Association of Realtors basically put their hands up and said, you know what, we're just going to settle. It's not worth fighting this, right? And the substance of the lawsuit, this guy basically said that he did not realize that his listing agent was going to be paying the buyer agent to bring buyers to the property. All right. Now, whether you agree with that or disagree with that, that's up to you. But I will tell you, when you offer compensation on a listing, traditionally, it creates more demand for said listing. It's almost like an auction-like effect on a listing, right? When you're in the status where we're at now, which a buyer has to sign a document with a buyer's agent, we don't know. The other thing is we don't know what commission is. So we're literally showing properties for free, basically. We do not know if a seller is offering compensation or not. We're literally out here on the streets showing homes, and we don't know if we're being compensated for our time, okay? And the fact is, this guy won this lawsuit, and he basically said that he didn't realize that he had to pay a buyer agent, right? Which is just completely crazy because on every single listing agreement, you have areas where it's the total commission offered and another section where how much commission the listing agent is taking and how much commission a buyer agent is taking. It is literally cut and dry. I don't know how much clearer it could be. On top of that, in most states, and I practice real estate in 2 states, I also have over 130 agents between 5 states, okay? Most of these states that we operate in require a seller's estimated closing costs where they could get an idea of where the monies are going. Again, it is an estimate, but it's usually pretty darn close to what they're going to walk away with outside of what their lien is on their house in terms of a mortgage, right? So this guy wins hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Then he creates an alternative to the real estate industry and is basically offering, let's say, paid tours from buyer's agents. And that's it. Like they're getting paid like $40 for a tour or something like that. So in my opinion, I think that disrupting the real estate market is good in one hand, because what it does is it creates competition for other brokerages to step up their game, figure out different things, and innovate inside of the industry. On the other hand, it could also be some levels of corruption. And that is my opinion, what happened during that lawsuit. Most agents, most consumers would agree with me, especially if you are a buyer, because you as a buyer have to pay normally 2 things. You have your down payment and you have your closing costs. Your closing costs could be anywhere from like, let's say 2 to 3.5, maybe up to 4%. Okay. Now you have to go out, sign a document with an agent saying how much you are going to potentially compensate them if they cannot collect the commission from the seller. I've been lucky enough to collect commissions from my sellers. I have not charged a buyer agent a dime, and I have not done that in the last 9 years. All right. But now, in terms of this mindset shift that I've been talking about, the DOJ is getting involved again, and they are basically saying that requiring buyers to sign a buyer agency contract or even a single property tour form with a buyer could potentially create some levels of antitrust violations. I'm going to share an article with you because this is just unbelievable. We as agents have been talking about this for months, for years, and now all of a sudden this shift happens, and now the DOJ is getting involved again, and now they're saying the complete opposite of what has happened, where buyers should have the choice to see homes without being tied or locked into an agent. So imagine being locked in with an agent that sold one house in the last 24 months, right? How are you going to potentially get an offer accepted and be competitive in the marketplace when you're working with an agent that you were forced to sign a contract with to some capacity? You can't even tour a damn home outside of an open house if it's a private tour without signing some levels of documents with an agent. I'm going to share this article with you because I just think that what has been happening inside of this country, this is just like the remnants of what has been happening. And now, again, a mindset shift. All right, so here we go. The DOJ comes out against the National Association of Realtors Commission lawsuit settlement. There's nothing quite like an 11th hour twist. On Sunday evening, less than 48 hours before the National Association of Realtors Commission lawsuit settlement agreement is set to head for final approval, the Department of Justice filed its long-awaited statement of interest in the Sitzer-Burnett suit. So those were the people involved with this lawsuit. The DOJ noted in the filing that it did not participate in the litigation or in the negotiations of the proposed settlement. The United States continues to scrutinize policies and practices in the residential real estate industry that may stifle competition. Competition in real estate is critical, and home ownership is a key component of wealth of American households. While the DOJ had previously taken a stand against the practice of cooperative compensation, if you don't know what cooperative compensation is, it's exactly what I just told you prior. It's basically a listing agent collecting their fee and offering half or a portion of that fee to a buyer agent. That creates demand, that creates an auction-like effect on your listing versus the way it is now, which is basically sellers are charging a price of admission to see their home because they are, or I should say the industry is forcing buyers to sign an agreement with a buyer agent and potentially has to pay that buyer agent. So there's the cost of admission versus what I like to call when I'm having these conversations an auction-like effect, which is what it was prior. a practice the settlement still allows for, albeit off the MLS. So what they mean by that is brokers could still offer compensation, but we have no freaking clue what that compensation is. And even if we call said agent, that listing agent that is, they sometimes are not at the liberty to tell us how much the compensation is based on what the seller wants. They could just say something like, just write it in, they're offering it, but we're not at the liberty to tell you what the amount is. Could be $1, could be $100, could be $10,000, right? So on and so forth. This settlement term was not the only one the DOJ took issue with. Instead, the DOJ challenged the settlement provisions that requires buyers and their buyers' agents to enter into a written agreement prior to touring the home. So you could have a, let's say, single property tour form that binds you with a buyer agent for a set amount of time, for a set amount of money on a certain property. That means you would be forced to use that agent to buy said property. There's also a full buyer agency agreement, which opens you up to seeing every single property with that agent if you are comfortable with them. But the problem is, if you are not comfortable with them, getting out of said contract is very difficult. This provision itself raises independent concerns under the antitrust laws, which could be addressed in multiple ways. The ways in which the DOJ suggests rectifying the perceived issues are to eliminate the buyer-broker agreement requirement, or to disclaim that the settlement creates any immunity or defense under the antitrust laws. I am telling you right now, as an agent that's been doing this forever, just to be reading the rhetoric that happened prior to this settlement and how this was going to be a major shift for the real estate industry, and this is the way that it was going to be done, to now reading this is literally a complete 180. And it took to after elections to get to this point. And it has been unfreaking believable for me to be reading these things. It is absolutely insane to me. Additionally, the DOJ writes that the court could clarify that approval of the settlement affords no immunity or defense for the buyer-agent provisions. The DOJ believes the buyer-broker agreements have the potential to limit how brokers compete for clients. So again, if you go to Zillow or Realtor.com and you contact one of those agents that's paying like thousands or tens of thousands of dollars to get connected to said buyer, and by the way, that is what they're doing. We have to pay a ton of money in order to get connected with a buyer because they own these portals and they spend a ton of money on Google to get your data and resell it to agents. That's basically the way it works, guys. Okay. Now what they're saying is that that is potentially an issue where buyers have to sign an agreement with a buyer agent in order to see a property. It bears a close resemblance to prior restrictions among competitors that courts have found to violate the antitrust laws in other proceedings and could limit rather than enhance competition for buyers among buyer brokers. I'm telling you, I'm reading this live, and for me to even be reading these things, listen, if you're an agent out there, you know what I'm talking about. If you're the general public, we have been talking about these things for so long and creating tools and systems and just verbiage in order to help you guys out to find a home. And now, again, this 180 shift from the DOJ, it's just mind-boggling to me, all right? And I feel like that has been going on with a lot of things, especially mainstream media, especially things in politics. It's just like, again, this complete 180. All right, let's proceed. As the DOJ believes this potentially cause antitrust issues in the future, they are asking Judge Stephen Bowe if he granted final approval of the settlement. To clarify, that such approval does not address whether the proposed settlement prevents and restrains current antitrust violations, remedies past violations, or contains revised policies and practices that comply with the antitrust laws. According to the statement of interest in ruling on the commission lawsuit settlement, the court's job is to determine if the proposed settlement achieves important concessions in the interest of private actors in the litigation. But the DOJ notes that an approval of the settlement does not prevent or restrain ongoing antitrust violations or remedies past violations, or itself contemplates practices that fully comply with the antitrust laws. So again, in one hand, they were saying, okay, no more commission on the MLS, agents could steer. Now agents don't know if they're being compensated. Then they wanted sellers to be represented by listing agents and to pay their listing agent, and they wanted buyers to pay their buyer agent and have a contract with said buyer agent, right? Completely separate entities. But listing agents and sellers could potentially still offer compensation, but it has to be done outside of the bounds of the MLS, which makes things very confusing. And it's basically just adding another step to the process and adds another level of negotiations between the buyer and the seller. How much is the buyer agent going to, like right now, we could write our commission on an agreement. We couldn't do that before. We saw what the commission was on the MLS, right? That's what we got paid. Now it's up for debate, right? Are we getting paid? Are we not getting paid? What are we writing in? Are you going to lose an offer because we're writing something in? It's all a complete mess, in my opinion. We have been navigating these things with success, but there has been a lot of agents that have been having trouble because you have to have hard and high level conversations with both your seller and your buyer, right? It just made it substantially harder. But now there's like a flip, right? It's just completely reversed. The DOJ notes that the approval of the settlement does not preclude any future enforcement actions by the United States in compliance with the proposed settlement or new NAR rules implementing that settlement affords no defense to any such enforcement actions. However, the DOJ notes that if any brokerage, agents, or NAR does find themselves in an antitrust suit moving forward, they may attempt to use any findings in the court decision as a shield against a future enforcement action by the United States. The approval hearing for NAR settlement, as well as the MLS and brokerages who choose to opt into the NAR settlement and the Home Services of America, is slated to take place on Tuesday afternoon in Missouri. So that's this coming Tuesday to see what the final approval may end up being. In a statement, NAR said that it will continue to advocate for final approval of our settlement on November 26th. In a motion filed on Thursday in support of the plaintiff's motion for final approval of the settlement, NAR called its settlement a hard fought. That's not true at all. They fought a little bit, right? We pay a ton of money to the National Association, enough where they could afford an $800 or $900 million lawsuit, and then just put their hands up and said, okay, we're done fighting this. Because, some person said that they didn't know that their agent was paying a buyer agent when it's clearly stipulated within the documents, right? It's clearly in the documents. This isn't something that's like hidden in some complex language, right? The trade group stated that it still believes its appeal of the jury's verdict would have been strong, but it did not wish to gamble its own existence on an appeal and several more years of litigation. So basically what they're saying there is what I just said, that we put their hands up, NAR put their hands up, they said, all right, we're going to wipe our hands clean, let's settle this. But in turn, settling it created this ripple in the way real estate is conducted. While the settlement was not what NAR wanted, no shit, it was the only path guaranteed to avoid a catastrophic outcome, NAR's motion states. I don't know how they could determine that. Maybe because of the way things were versus the way things are. I think if this happened, like let's say next year or now, I think this would have been a lot different, because the way things have been happening, as I said before, are just completely backwards in a lot of things in this country. The DOJ previously intervened on the No Select Commission lawsuit and separately won a pivotal case that allows the department to resume investigating NAR. Motion addresses buyer-broker agreements. All right, here we go. In their motion for final approval of NAR settlement filed last Tuesday, the Sitzer-Burnett plaintiffs addressed some concerns surrounding the buyer-broker agreements. Among these clarifications is that brokers cannot amend a buyer-broker agreement with the buyer once they know the compensation being offered by the seller on the property a buyer wishes to submit an offer on, that they cannot accept seller-paid or builder-paid bonuses in addition to the compensation agreed upon with their buyer, and that the amount the buyer broker is being paid must be specific and not arranged or written as whatever is being offered by the cooperating broker or seller. So what that means is if you sign an agreement with me, and let's just say it's at 3% or 3 bananas, right? Just to be a little PC here. So if it's at 3% and the seller on the back end is offering 4%, I can't go alter that agreement and increase that amount to 4%. Adversely, if I was signing an agreement with you at 1 banana, okay, and the seller was offering 3 bananas, I cannot alter that. In the same essence, if I was to do 3 bananas again and the seller was offering 1 banana, right, I could always try to figure out a way to be compensated the rest from the seller if it's not a competitive offer or we're not in competition with other buyers, right? We could sometimes figure out that and navigate that. But what we can't do is go up. What we can do is go down, okay? Which is effectively taking money out of the buyer agent pocket. Additionally, the filing noted that if a buyer and their agent use a touring agreement prior to signing a full-fledged buyer representation agreement, the settlement does not permit brokers to collect more compensation than specified. Okay, they're basically saying you can't even do that in a touring agreement, which makes sense as well. Depending on how the court considers the DOJ's concerns in its statement of interest, these clarifications may be for nothing. So again, this is just, I can't explain this enough to you guys how much of a mindset shift this really is, because this has been something that we have been talking about in the industry for months, if not for over a year. And as of August 17th, that's when these rules and practices took place. No commission on the MLS. We don't know what we're getting paid. And buyers have to sign an agreement with their agent. Now, all of a sudden, the DOJ gets involved again and is saying that this could create antitrust violations. We have been saying that for literally months that this may happen because it eliminates competition. And when we're working with a buyer, right, and I don't do this, I show everything. I don't call agents. I don't figure out what the commission is because I know enough of what I'm doing in order to figure these things out on the fly and figure out how I could get paid somehow, some way. At least that's the way I've been doing it. So I'm not limiting my buyers to certain properties that are offering compensation. And there's been some real estate companies out here that have been creating alternatives to the MLS where they're literally showing what the compensation is, and what it's sometimes called is a buyer broker compensation form, which they upload to these websites, and you're visibly seeing what is being offered anyway. So they're creating alternatives to the MLS. The problem with that, again, in terms of antitrust, if you are a buyer agent and you're using your company website to dictate what homes your buyer is seeing because they are company listed homes and they are company listed homes that are offering compensation, and you're not showing them any other properties beside company listed homes or another company that is also publishing what they're being offered, how is that not a problem too? So people and brokerages are trying to circumvent what has happened within the settlement and is creating more animosity between the industry. So of course, when somebody does something, you're either going to punt or try to pivot and try to create, figure out creative ways in order to continue to practice the way that you were previously practicing. But in my opinion, that is also an invitation for some antitrust violations. Again, I don't think these things should have happened to begin with. Sellers know where money is going. If you don't know where the money is going, either you hired an agent that didn't explain things clearly enough. If you didn't know that we were offering a portion of our compensation to a buyer agent, they did not explain things clearly enough. You did not read the contracts clearly enough because everything is stipulated in those contracts, and it's your agent's obligation to explain what is on those contracts. And I do not believe that the majority of the majority of sellers out there didn't know where money was going. Okay. And I also don't believe that sellers didn't realize that they can negotiate commissions. Jesus, the day, a couple days prior to this, I literally wrote them at ABC News. It was, I can't remember her name. They're on there on national news saying all of a sudden now sellers could negotiate their commissions. Jesus, we were able to negotiate commissions forever. I don't know a listing appointment. I've sold hundreds of homes. I don't know a listing appointment that I walked into where a seller didn't try to negotiate the commission, right? But they're on national news stating that, oh, now we can negotiate commissions and sellers don't have to pay their buyer agent. That's not necessarily true. Right? It's a mistruth. They're misspeaking and saying these things. And I've spoke. It was Rebecca Jarvis, by the way. That's who it was. I've been speaking about these things for a while, at least internally to my team. And it's just really asinine the way this like mainstream media is painting the picture of what is going on, when the majority of people are generally happy. They're getting substantially over the list price. We're creating an auction-like effect on their home. Now that's completely wiped away. Now buyers have to potentially pay the down payment for their home. They have to pay the closing costs of their home. And now they have to potentially pay another 1, 2, or 3 plus bananas to afford their buyer agent before they even walk in the door, right? It just doesn't seem fair. And this is another one of those situations where, you look at this, and you don't even have to be in real estate to understand these things. You look at this and you're reading this and you go, this doesn't make any sense at all. And that's really what has been happening with a lot of things in this country. Nothing makes sense anymore, right? Nothing makes sense. Everything that is going on, you're watching the news, you're watching an ad on TV, it's just completely crazy. And I think that people want to adopt their certain ideologies and force them onto you, right? That's effectively what this is, right? They're forcing these things onto you and trying to change the way the industry has been working and operating for the last God only knows how many years. And now all of a sudden there's these monumental changes, and it's affecting both sellers and buyers, because some buyers are working with lower level agents and they won't even take them to houses that are not offering compensation. Well, if they're not offering compensation, there may be less competition on said listing, and that could be an opportunity for your buyer. They're not even touring that damn home because the buyer opted to only tour homes that is offering compensation so they don't have to come out of pocket. How is that not some level of steering, right? Can't we just keep things the way that they are, or at least innovate to a point where it makes sense for not only the general public, which is buyers, sellers, renters, and agents alike? It is very confusing, and it is just a sad situation. I'm interested to see what the DOJ is going to do here, if there's going to be any reversals on this lawsuit or how they're going to get involved, because if the DOJ gets involved, I think it's going to create some trouble for the people that were involved with this litigation or created this litigation. And on top of that, the same damn guy that won all of this money creates an industry corrupter to try to circumvent the way real estate has been done over the past God only knows how many years. It is crazy to me. It is a sad story. I love this industry. I've been in this industry for about 9 years now. I was a contractor for 10 years prior to that. This is all I know. This is my livelihood, right? And they're making it substantially harder for both buyers and sellers to get from point A to point B, okay? Substantially harder. All right, guys. I'll see you on the next one. Bye-bye.